Why has the same people been expelled, persecuted and hated for more than 2,000 years in almost every corner of the world? The Jews have carried the weight of religious prejudices, economic accusations, and even political conspiracies that turned them into the perfect target of kings, empires, and dictators. But this hatred was never casual. Behind every persecution there was fear, ignorance, and the need to find someone to blame. A hatred that crossed centuries and cultures until it led to one of the most terrible crimes of humanity, the Holocaust. Today we will try to answer one of the most disturbing questions in history. Why did everyone hate the Jews? Why did everyone hate the Jews throughout history? The origins of the Jewish people and their first differences with other people. The Jewish people have one of the most ancient and singular histories of humanity. Their roots go back more than 3,000 years in the region of Canaan, a relatively small territory but of enormous geopolitical importance, located between Mesopotamia and Egypt, two of the most powerful civilizations of antiquity. This place, known as the Land Between Empires, was for centuries a coveted commercial and military corridor, constantly disputed by greater powers. However, there arose a people who, unlike many of their neighbors, developed a unique identity, deeply marked by their religion and by a sense of collective belonging that would distinguish them from the rest from very early on. The most important and also the most controversial characteristic of the Jews was their faith in a single God. In a world where the norm was to worship multiple divinities, the Egyptians adored Ra, Isis and Osiris, the Mesopotamians Marduk, Ishtar and Enlil, the Greeks Zeus, Athena and Apollo, and the Romans Jupiter, Mars and Venus. The Jews affirmed that only one single God existed, Yahweh, invisible, transcendent and jealous of his people. This God could not be represented in statues or in images, which went against the artistic and religious tradition of polytheistic cultures, which filled temples and squares with sculptures of their god. For the neighboring peoples, the Jews were strange, even arrogant, for denying the deities that everyone else accepted and venerated as evident. That faith in a single god was accompanied by an idea even more radical for the time, that of being a chosen people. According to their traditions, God had made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants, promising them blessing and a land of their own in exchange for fidelity and obedience. That covenant was renewed centuries later in the time of Moses, when, after the departure from Egypt, a central story in Jewish memory, the Israelites received the Torah on Mount Sinai. The Torah, which includes the Ten Commandments and an extensive legal body, was not only a set of religious norms, it was a complete code that regulated all aspects of life, from food, hygiene, and the weekly rest to the calendar of festivities, family and social relations, and the laws of justice. This meant that the Jewish people did not share only a religion, but that their entire daily life was organized around that faith. Religion and national identity were deeply intertwined. To be Jewish was not only to profess a belief, but to belong to a community united by the law of God. For other peoples of the region, who mixed and adopted foreign customs easily, this rigidity was difficult to understand and even irritating. Throughout their early history, the Jews experienced processes that reinforced even more that identity. According to biblical tradition, they descended from the 12 tribes of Israel, daughters of Jacob, who settled in Canaan after the Exodus from Egypt. Modern archaeology suggests that the origins of Israel were linked to Semitic groups who lived in the hills of Canaan and who little by little distinguished themselves from other Canaanite peoples thanks to exclusive religious practices such as the prohibition of idols, the sabbatical rest, and a distinct diet. This conscious differentiation with respect to their neighbors strengthened the notion of being a unique people. Another central element that distinguished them from the beginning was circumcision. This rite, practiced on males on the 8th day after birth, was understood as the physical sign of the covenant with God. It It was a mark of identity that differentiated the Jews bodily from the rest. For them, it was a sacred symbol of belonging. For other peoples, however, it was seen as a strange or even barbaric practice. Greeks and Romans, who exalted the perfection of the human body and displayed it in gyms, public baths, and statues, considered circumcision a mutilation. This simple physical detail would be, for centuries, a source of mockery, rejection, and discrimination. The dietary laws known as kashrut also separated the Jews from their neighbors. Among the most notable prohibitions was that of consuming pork, an animal that did form part of the habitual diet of other Mediterranean peoples. Likewise, they had to avoid shellfish, certain types of birds, and mixing meat with milk. These restrictions, incomprehensible to the surrounding cultures, prevented the Jews from sharing banquets, which in the ancient world were key moments of sociability and politics. Thus, what for the Jews was obedience to their divine law, for others was seen as voluntary isolation or disdain toward others. Their early history was marked by moments of glory and tragedy. During the reign of David and Solomon, around the year 1000 before Christ, the Jewish people reached their maximum political splendor. Jerusalem was converted into capital and religious center, and the first temple was raised as a symbol of unity. However, after the death of Solomon, the kingdom was divided in two: Israel in the north and Judah in the south, which weakened political cohesion and made them vulnerable in the face of the great empires. In the year 722 before Christ, the Assyrian Empire conquered Israel and deported a great part of its population, which gave rise to the legend of the lost tribes. Later, in the year 586 before Christ, the Babylonians conquered Judah, destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem, and deported thousands of Jews to Babylon. This exile, far from erasing their identity, reinforced it. The Jews maintained their practices, wrote and compiled a great part of their sacred text, and consolidated the synagogue as a space for prayer and teaching. Even under foreign domination, they refused to render worship to the Babylonian gods, which earned them both respect and rejection. When Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, conquered Babylon, he allowed the return of the Jews to Jerusalem and the reconstruction of the temple. But the experience of exile had left profound marks. The conviction that their survival depended on fidelity to their God and to his law. This conviction would accompany them throughout their history and would become a decisive factor in their cultural resistance against empires such as the Greek and the Roman. Thus, the origins of the Jewish people not only tell us of a human group that was born in a small strip of land in the Near East, but of a community that from the beginning defined itself by its faith, by its resistance to assimilation, and by a law that organized all aspects of its life. These differences were a cause of pride and of unity, but also of incomprehension and rejection. The seed of what centuries later would become hostility toward the Jews was already planted in these first encounters with their neighbors and with the great empires of antiquity. For the Jews, this rite represented the physical sign of their covenant with God and was a mark of collective identity that was transmitted from generation to generation since the time of Abraham. Circumcision was not only a religious act, but also a tangible symbol of belonging, a reminder that each new member of the people was bound to the covenant with their God. But for the Greco-Roman cultures, who greatly valued the aesthetics of the human body and exalted physical perfection in gyms, athletic competitions, and sculptures, this practice was incomprehensible. Greek philosophers and Roman writers described it as a barbaric, grotesque custom, contrary to nature. This rejection was not a minor detail. It contributed to accentuating the perception that the Jews were a strange people, different even physically, which reinforced their cultural isolation. Something similar happened with their dietary laws. The rules of kashrut, which prohibited eating certain animals such as pork or shellfish, and which demanded specific methods of slaughter and preparation of food, created a practical distance with their neighbors. In the ancient world, sharing a banquet was not only about eating meeting, it was a central act of social integration, a space where political alliances were sealed, disputes were resolved, and community life was celebrated. The fact that the Jews could not participate in many of these gatherings due to their religious restrictions was seen as a gesture of disdain, of deliberate rejection toward other people. However, in reality, it was a strict obedience to the traditions inherited from their faith. That difference, however, nourished the idea that the Jews were a closed people, reluctant to mix. Resistance to assimilation was another decisive trait that marked their history. From their origins, the Jews demonstrated a remarkable capacity to maintain their identity in the face of powers that tried to absorb. During the exile in Babylon, in the 6th century before Christ, when thousands of them were deported after the destruction of the First Temple, other peoples would have adopted the gods, languages, and customs of their conquerors in order to survive. The Jews, on the other hand, clung strongly to their religion, their rituals, and the hope of return. It was in that context when the synagogue took on a decisive importance as a place of prayer and teaching, and when the scribes began to gather, order, and write many of the texts that would later become part of the Hebrew Bible. That same spirit of resistance manifested itself centuries later with the arrival of Alexander the Great and the expansion of Hellenism. Greek culture not only conquered territories with armies, but also with theaters, gymnasiums, temples, and a philosophy that fascinated almost all the peoples of the Mediterranean. The cities were filled with Greek customs, from the language to the way of dressing. Many Semitic peoples quickly adapted to this new culture that promised prestige and progress. However, among the Jews there was a division. While some accepted certain Greek influences, others rejected them radically. The breaking point came with the Seleucid dynasty, which ruled over Judea and tried to impose the worship of the Greek gods in the very temple of Jerusalem. For the pious Jews, that was an intolerable desecration. The consequence was the rebellion of the Maccabees in the 2nd century before Christ, one of the first religious wars of independence in history, which ended with the purification of the temple and the establishment of a Jewish dynasty of their own, the Hasmoneans. But the conflict with the great powers did not end there. When Rome extended its dominion over Judea, the situation became even more tense. Rome tolerated diverse religions in its provinces as long as they did not question the imperial authority or the unity of the state. The Jews, however, were particularly problematic. They refused to worship the emperor as a divinity, which for the Romans was a fundamental civic duty. This refusal fed the image of the Jews as a stubborn people, difficult to govern and always on the verge of rebellion. The tensions reached their peak in the 1st century after Christ, when the Great Jewish Revolt broke out against Rome. It was a long and bloody conflict that culminated in the year 70 with the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem at the hands of the legions of the future Emperor Titus. This catastrophe not only meant the loss of the spiritual center of the Jewish people, but also a devastating blow to their political autonomy. Many were enslaved or dispersed in what is known as the diaspora. However, even in exile, the Jews maintained their faith and their customs, thus reinforcing their identity in the face of adversity. Years later, in the 132nd after Christ, a new rebellion led by Simon Bar Kokhba attempted to restore Jewish independence. At first it was successful, but it ended in an even harsher defeat. The Romans destroyed entire cities, prohibited the practice of the Jewish religion in Jerusalem, and renamed the region as Palestine to erase its connection with the people of Israel. Far from eliminating their identity, these measures reinforced the memory of resistance and the attachment to their traditions. Thus, from their origins until late antiquity, the Jews demonstrated time and again that they were not a people willing to dissolve into the dominant cultures. That fidelity to their faith and to their law made them a unique case in ancient history. a small people without a great empire or vast conquests, but with an extraordinary capacity to survive, preserve their memory, and maintain their differences in the face of much more powerful civilizations. And although that uniqueness allowed them to endure throughout the centuries, it was also one of the main reasons why they were viewed with suspicion, hostility, and, at many moments in history, with open hatred. Throughout these centuries, the differences of the Jews with their neighbors were not based on race, since ethnically they were related to other Semitic peoples of the region, such as the Phoenicians, the Arameans, or the Babylonians themselves. Their cultural and linguistic roots were shared, and in appearance there was not a great distance between them. However, what radically distinguished them was their religious conception and the way they organized their life around it. While other peoples of the region adapted their beliefs according to historical circumstances, incorporating new gods or merging their traditions with those of the conquerors, the Jews insisted on keeping intact the faith in Yahweh, an invisible and unique God who admitted no rivals. This absolute fidelity to a single divinity was bewildering in a world where religious flexibility was the norm. For their neighbors, refusing to venerate the local gods was not only an act of spiritual arrogance, but also a challenge to social harmony. The ancients believed that the well-being of the community depended on the protection of their gods, and that those who rejected them put at risk the stability of all. The conviction of being a chosen people also generated tensions from very early times. According to biblical tradition, God had established an exclusive covenant with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That divine promise granted the Jews a sense of particular mission, to live according to the Torah and to maintain the purity of their faith. For them, this feeling was a reason for pride and for hope in the midst of adversities. However, for those who observed them from outside, that belief could be interpreted as an attitude of superiority, as if they considered themselves apart from the common destiny of humanity. The religious and social practices also reinforced this perception of difference. Their rules of ritual purity, the observance of the Sabbath as a sacred day of rest, the importance of the temple and of the sacrifices, and even their tribal organization made them a people governed by rules very different from those of the rest of the ancient world. For many of their contemporaries, these customs were seen as eccentricities that made coexistence difficult. Over time, this invisible barrier became more noticeable every time the Jews came into contact with great empires. During the Assyrian and Babylonian rule, for example, the conquerors used to deport the defeated peoples to integrate them into their imperial structure. Many of those peoples, once displaced, ended up adopting the customs of their new masters and disappeared as cultural entities. The Jews, on the other hand, even far from their land, preserved their texts, their practices, and their national identity. The famous episode of the exile in Babylon demonstrated their capacity to resist cultural dissolution. While others dissolved into the imperial tide, they reinforced their traditions and adapted them to survive without a temple and without their own territory. Later, under Persian rule, the Jews enjoyed a certain tolerance that allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. But that same restoration reinforced even more the idea that they were a separate, distinct people with a jealous God who demanded absolute fidelity. During the following centuries, every attempt by foreign powers to absorb them into a common identity, whether the Hellenism of the Greeks or the Romanization of the empire, failed largely because of that firmness. This persistence in maintaining their differences, which for the Jews was a virtue and a sign of loyalty to God, was frequently interpreted by others as stubbornness or even as contempt toward the outside world. The clash with the ancient empires, Babylon, Rome, and the diaspora. The Jewish people from their origins lived in a strategic and at the same time dangerous region, Canaan, a natural bridge between the great powers of antiquity. Situated between Mesopotamia and Egypt, that strip of land was coveted again and again by the great empires that sought to control the commercial and military routes. For the Israelites, that geographic destiny meant a constant clash with much more powerful civilizations, clashes that profoundly marked their history and their identity. One of the first great conflicts occurred in the 6th century before Christ, when the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the Kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem was besieged and finally destroyed in the year 586 before Christ. The Temple of Solomon, religious and spiritual center of the Jewish people, was razed, and a great part of the elite of Jerusalem was deported to Babylon. This episode, known as the Babylonian exile, became a deep wound and a turning point. For any other conquered people, deportation usually meant the gradual disappearance of their identity. However, the Jews managed to transform that tragedy into a stage of spiritual reaffirmation. Without a temple and far from their land, they strengthened their traditions, compiled their scriptures, and turned law and prayer into pillars that could accompany them wherever they were. Instead of disappearing as a nation, the exile reinforced their conviction of being a distinct people, protected by a God who, although he punished them for their sins, never abandoned them completely. The Persian domination which succeeded the Babylonian after the conquest of Cyrus the Great offered the Jews a respite. Cyrus allowed many to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple known as the Second Temple. This gesture was seen by the Jews as a divine act, a confirmation that Yahweh continued to act in history. However, the calm would not last long. With the arrival of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before Christ, the known world was transformed. Greek culture, with its philosophy, its art, and its polytheism, began to spread throughout the East. The majority of conquered peoples quickly adopted Hellenism, integrating Greek customs and beliefs. The Jews, on the other hand, resisted. Although some more affluent sectors accepted certain Greek influences, a large part of the people considered these practices a threat to their faith. This tension exploded in the 2nd century before Christ when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes attempted to impose Greek worship in Jerusalem and profaned the temple. The response was one of the most famous rebellions of antiquity, the Revolt of the Maccabees. This uprising managed to recover control of the temple and reaffirm Jewish identity in the face of foreign imposition. The next decisive clash would come with Rome. After expanding toward the east, the Romans conquered Judea in the 1st century before Christ, transforming it into a province of the empire. At first, Rome tried to govern with a certain flexibility, respecting local customs as long as they did not interfere with its authority. However, the inflexible character of the Jews in religious matters soon became a problem. While other peoples accepted without difficulty the incorporation of the Roman gods into the local pantheon, the Jews categorically rejected worshipping the emperor or participating in sacrifices to pagan divinities. For Rome, this was not only a religious peculiarity, but a direct threat to the principle of imperial cohesion, which was based on the common veneration of the gods and of Caesar. The tension kept growing until it culminated in one of the bloodiest rebellions of ancient history. In the year 66 of our era, the Great Jewish Revolt broke out. For 4 years, the rebels resisted the power of Rome, but in the year 70, the legions commanded by Titus besieged Jerusalem and razed the city. The Second Temple was destroyed, a trauma so deep that until today the Jews remember that event as one of the great tragedies of their history. Rome, determined to give an exemplary punishment, not only destroyed the religious heart of the Jewish people, but deported thousands of its inhabitants as slaves and dispersed others throughout the empire. Far from extinguishing itself, Jewish resistance continued. At the beginning of the 2nd century, Under the Emperor Hadrian, a new rebellion broke out, the Revolt of Bar Kokhba. Although it initially had some success, it ended in an even greater disaster. After suppressing the insurrection, Rome forbade the Jews to live in Jerusalem and renamed the province with the name Syria Palestina in a deliberate attempt to erase Jewish memory from the region. This moment marked the beginning of what is known as the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jewish people throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, which would continue for centuries. The diaspora did not mean the end of Jewish identity, but its transformation. The Jews adapted to life in different cities of the empire, from Alexandria to Rome, from Carthage to Antioch. There they became merchants, artisans, and scholars, but always maintaining their customs, their laws, and their faith. That ability to live as a cohesive community, even in foreign lands, was one of the keys to their historical survival. However, that same difference, visible and constant, also sowed suspicions and mistrust among the peoples with whom they lived. The clash with Babylon, with Rome, and finally the diaspora consolidated the Jewish people as a nation without a state, a people who lived dispersed but united by their religion and their historical memory. While others disappeared absorbed by greater empires, they managed to preserve an identity that would survive the passage of centuries. But that resistance and that fidelity to their faith also sowed the foundations of a hostility that, with time, would become recurrent persecutions in the Middle Ages and in later times. From hatred to systematic persecution, antisemitism in the Third Reich. Antisemitism, that is, hatred against the Jews, was not born with Nazism, but it was under the regime of Adolf Hitler when it reached a monstrous, systematic and organized dimension as never before in history. This hatred had very deep roots in European culture. For centuries, the Jews were the object of marginalization, persecutions, and poisonous myths that marked them as responsible for all evils. In the Middle Ages, they were accused of poisoning wells, of causing the Black Plague, of kidnapping children for ritual sacrifices, or of conspiring in secret against Christianity. These accusations, completely unfounded, served to justify lynchings, mass expulsions, and pogroms, especially in regions of Central and Eastern Europe. The Jews were forced to live in isolated ghettos, to wear marks on their clothing that distinguished them from the rest of the population, and to survive only in restricted trades, such as moneylending, an activity that later was used as a propagandistic weapon to link them with usury and economic power. With the arrival of modernity and the Enlightenment in the 18th century, many thought that anti-Semitism would vanish. The ideals of equality and citizenship seemed to open the door to integration. And in fact, in some countries, the Jews obtained civil rights, became outstanding intellectuals, scientists, artists, and influential entrepreneurs. However, hostility never disappeared. Modernity brought with it new forms of hatred. It was no longer only about religious differences, but about an alleged racial inferiority. At the end of the 19th century, in the midst of the era of European nationalism, the Jews were presented as a threat to the purity of the nations. The idea spread that they were an eternally foreign people, incapable of assimilating, loyal only to themselves. The rise of pseudo-scientific racial theories in the 19th century reinforced these perceptions. Authors and scientists of the time classified humanity into hierarchical races and placed the Jews as a corrupting race, associated both with exploitative capitalism and with revolutionary communism. This double discourse was particularly useful. The Jews were accused at the same time of being behind the financial power that enslaved workers, and also of organizing revolutions that threatened social order. This contradiction did not prevent the myths from prospering because they responded to collective fears and resentments. A particularly influential example was the dissemination of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a false document produced in Tsarist Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, which presented the Jews as authors of a secret plan to dominate the world. Although it was an evident fraud, It circulated widely in Europe and in America, feeding the conspiratorial fantasies that decades later Nazism would use to justify its ideology. It was in that ground fertilized with secular prejudices, racial theories, and conspiracies that Nazism arose. After the German defeat in the First World War, the country was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, stripped of territories with strong military restrictions and forced to pay economic reparations that destroyed its economy. The inflation of the 1920s ruined millions of families, and the subsequent Great Depression of 1929 plunged the German people into misery and unemployment. At the same time, the Weimar Republic faced political instability, with clashes between communists, nationalists, and a deeply divided society. In this context of collective frustration, Hitler and the National Socialist Party offered a clear and simple enemy to blame: the Jews. Hitler did not invent antisemitism, but he transformed it into a central ideology of his movement. In his book Mein Kampf, written in 1924 while he was in prison, he exposed his vision of the world. For him, history was a racial struggle between superior and inferior peoples. He considered the Jews not as a religion but as a parasitic race, a cancer that corrupted nations from within. In his narrative, the Jews were at the same time responsible for the cultural and moral decadence of Germany, for international capitalist exploitation, and for the advance of communism, which he called Jewish Bolshevism. This delirious vision, though contradictory, was effective because it offered a simple explanation for complex problems. Germany was not in crisis because of political mistakes, global economic factors, or the disaster of war, but because of the fault of a supposedly conspiratorial minority. The message of Hitler was reinforced by the massive use of propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, turned anti-Jewish prejudices into part of German daily life. Posters, films, newspapers, and even children's books presented the Jews as deformed, greedy, and dangerous beings. This construction of an internal enemy allowed the population to be united around a common objective: the purification of Germany. At the same time, the regime used pseudo-scientific arguments, falsified racial studies, and nationalist discourses to present the exclusion of the Jews not as an act of hatred, but as a supposed defense of the German people. Thus, a hatred that for centuries had manifested itself in sporadic persecutions, expulsions, or discrimination was transformed under Nazism into a totalitarian political project. What before were dispersed prejudices, under Hitler became state policy, first with legal marginalization through the Nuremberg laws of 1935, later with open violence such as in the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, and finally with the plan of systematic extermination that was known as the Final Solution. In barely a few years, antisemitism went from being a deeply rooted social sentiment to becoming the basis of an industrialized genocide without precedent in human history. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they began to transform antisemitism into an authentic state policy. The hatred, which until then had been latent in German society, became a legal norm, governmental action, and an inseparable component of daily life. The first measures were not presented openly as violence, but as a process of gradual exclusion, carefully designed to isolate the Jews from German society. The strategy was clear: to strip them little by little of their rights, their dignity, and their means of life, until they were left completely defenseless in the face of what would come next. In April of 1933, only a few months after Hitler's arrival to power, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was enacted. With this decree, thousands of Jewish officials, professors, doctors, judges, lawyers, and state employees were expelled from their jobs. It was a systematic purge that sought to eliminate the Jews from all spheres of administration and academic life. It was at its core an official declaration that they no longer had a place in the German state. That same year, the Nazis organized a national boycott against Jewish businesses. On the 1st of April, the SA stationed themselves in front of shops, pharmacies, banks, and medical offices of Jewish ownership, painting stars of David on the doors, David on the windows, and intimidating customers so that they would not enter. Although the boycott lasted only one day, it had a strong symbolic impact. Discrimination ceased to be an individual or social act and became a policy backed by the power of the state. These initial measures were accompanied by an unprecedented propagandistic machine. Under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, the Ministry of Propaganda used all available means: newspapers, magazines, films, radio, which in those years was the most powerful medium, and even school materials intended to indoctrinate children. The Jews were portrayed as an internal enemy, a dangerous presence that contaminated German blood and culture. Works such as the infamous weekly Der Stürmer, directed by Julius Streicher, were dedicated exclusively to spreading grotesque caricatures and lies about the Jews, feeding the idea that they were immoral, corrupt, and threatening. In this way, antisemitism was normalized in daily life. The true turning point came in 1935 with the so-called Nuremberg Laws. These laws gave anti-Semitism a definitive legal framework. It was no longer about excluding the Jews from certain trades or ridiculing them in the press. It was about denying them their status as citizens. The legislation defined with bureaucratic precision who should be considered Jewish, not on the basis of faith or beliefs, but of lineage. It was enough to have 3 or even 2 Jewish grandparents to be classified as such, even if the person was a practicing Christian or had never set foot in a synagogue. Thus, a rigid racial category was created, impossible to modify. The immediate consequence was that the Jews lost their German citizenship, were excluded from the right to vote or to hold public office, and were forbidden to marry or maintain sexual relations with non-Jews, under the so-called Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. Discrimination became not only social, but inscribed in the very legal fabric of the Third Reich. During the following years, the siege kept tightening. The Jewish communities saw how they were forbidden to attend parks, cinemas, theaters, or restaurants. Jewish children were segregated in schools, and the doctors or lawyers who could still practice were only allowed to attend to Jewish patients. Absurd limitations were even imposed, such as the prohibition of having pets, of owning radios, or of driving automobiles. All this had no other purpose than to humiliate them and make them feel that they no longer formed part of German society. Thousands of families, unable to sustain themselves without work or rights, began to emigrate. However, many countries closed their borders or established very limited quotas for the entry of Jewish refugees, which left the majority trapped in an increasingly hostile Germany. The tension reached a critical point in 1938. That year, anti-Semitic policies radicalized after the annexation of Austria by Germany in March. With the arrival of Nazism, Austrian Jews were immediately subjected to public humiliations. They were forced to clean the streets on their knees, to sell their properties at ridiculous prices, or to endure beatings in front of the indifference of the authorities. The turning point was the pogrom known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which occurred on the 9th and 10th of November of 1938. Although the regime presented it as a spontaneous reaction of popular indignation after the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris at the hands of a young Polish Jew, in reality it was a carefully orchestrated operation by the Nazi authorities. For 2 nights, bands of the SA and civilians, encouraged by propaganda, set fire to synagogues throughout Germany and Austria, destroyed thousands of Jewish businesses, looted homes, and murdered dozens of people. More than 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, among them Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. The true purpose was not only to sow terror, but also to send a clear message. The Jews no longer had any refuge either inside or outside their communities. After Kristallnacht, it became clear that the regime had abandoned any appearance of gradualness or legality. From that moment on, persecution entered an openly violent and dehumanizing phase. Jewish life in Germany ceased to be possible. Their businesses were confiscated, their properties expropriated, and their dignity destroyed in public. The message was unequivocal. What until then had been exclusion and marginalization was transforming into a much more radical project, a prelude to the genocide that would be set in motion a few years later with the final solution. That night marked the point of no return. From then on, the Jews in Germany understood that their existence was in real danger. Kristallnacht not only destroyed businesses, synagogues, and homes, but it shattered the illusion that they could still resist within German society. It was no longer a matter of legal marginalization, nor of the gradual loss of rights. The message had been written with fire and broken glass. The street violence, approved and directed from the highest spheres of power, demonstrated that the state not only tolerated the attacks against the Jews, but promoted them. When the Second World War broke out in September of 1939, Nazi antisemitism ceased to be confined within the borders of the Reich. The invasion of Poland suddenly placed more than 3 million Jews under German control, and the magnitude of this challenge forced the Nazis to improvise new forms of control and repression. In the occupied cities, ghettos were established, walled or closed neighborhoods where the Jews were forced to live apart from the rest of the population. Warsaw, with almost 500,000 Jews confined, became the largest and most brutal of them. Other ghettos were set up in Łódź, Kraków, Lublin, and dozens of other cities. Life in these ghettos was unbearable. Hunger was deliberately used as a weapon. The rations assigned to the Jews were minimal, insufficient to survive, forcing them to resort to smuggling and to the black market. The overcrowding, with entire families sharing tiny rooms, favored the spread of diseases such as typhus. Thousands of people died every month from causes that under other conditions would have been avoidable. At the same time, Jewish councils, Judenräte, were established and forced to administer the ghettos, which placed community leaders in an impossible position, having to obey Nazi orders that directly affected their own neighbors. However, repression in the ghettos was only an intermediate step. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the machinery of death entered a new phase. After the advance of the German army, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile extermination squads, went into action. Their mission was clear: to execute massively the Jews and all those considered ideological enemies of the Reich. These units, composed of members of the SS, the Gestapo, and the police, acted with meticulous coldness. In cities, towns, and villages, they gathered entire communities, took them to the outskirts, and shot them in previously dug pits. One of the most atrocious episodes occurred in Babi Yar near Kiev in September of 1941. During only 2 days, the 29th and 30th of September, more than 33,000 Jews were murdered in a ravine, in an operation planned with military precision. Men, women, elderly, and children were forced to undress before being shot. This was only one example among hundreds of similar massacres throughout Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, and other occupied areas. It is estimated that the Einsatzgruppen murdered more than 1 million Jews between 1941 and 1942-42 in what is known as the Holocaust by bullets. However, this method of extermination presented logistical and psychological problems. The mass shootings required large resources and left a traumatic impact on the executors themselves who, although fanatical, were direct witnesses of the massacres. It was then that the Nazi leaders began to seek a more efficient system, less exhausting for those who carried it out. The definitive leap toward industrialized genocide took place at the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942. In January of that year, the Wannsee Conference was held in a villa on the outskirts of Berlin. Convened by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Central Office of Reich Security, the meeting brought together high Nazi officials, bureaucrats, and representatives of different ministries. In little more than 1 hour, the procedures were outlined to carry out the so-called final solution to the Jewish question: the mass deportation of European Jews to extermination camps in the East, where they would be systematically murdered. The decision represented a radical change. Until then, anti-Semitic policies had oscillated between expulsion, confinement, and sporadic violence. Now the declared objective was the total elimination of the Jewish population of Europe. The language used in Wannsee was cynical and bureaucratic. There was talk of evacuations and special treatment, euphemisms to conceal mass murder. To implement this policy, a network of extermination camps was built in occupied Poland. Unlike the concentration camps already existing, such as Dachau or Buchenwald, whose main objective was forced labor and political repression, the new camps had as their only function murder. Chelmno, inaugurated in December of 1941, was the first to use mobile gas chambers installed in trucks. Shortly after appeared Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, designed specifically for Operation Reinhard, which had as its goal the elimination of the Jews of the Polish general government. Later, Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek became symbols of extermination on an industrial scale. The overcrowded trains began to arrive from all parts of occupied Europe: France, Holland, Greece, Hungary, Italy, and many other countries. Entire families were deported under the pretext of a resettlement or work in the East. Upon arrival, they were subjected to immediate selections. The elderly, the sick, the women with children, and those unable to work were sent directly to the chambers, often disguised as communal showers. The bodies were then incinerated in crematory ovens or in open pits. The magnitude of the crime was devastating. Millions of lives were taken in a matter of only a few years. What had begun as legal and social discrimination in the Germany of 1933 had led, in less than 1 decade, to one of the greatest genocides in history, executed with a bureaucratic coldness that even today is difficult to comprehend. Upon arrival, the majority were sent directly to chambers disguised as showers, where they were murdered in a matter of minutes with Zyklon B gas or carbon monoxide. These murders were carried out with meticulous precision. The prisoners were forced to undress under the promise that they were going to receive a disinfection. They were given numbered tokens to maintain order, and then they were led to hermetically sealed enclosures where the executioners observed through peepholes the process of agony. Once the massacre was finished, special teams of prisoners, known as Sonderkommandos, were forced to remove the bodies, cut their hair, pull out their gold teeth, and prepare the corpses for incineration. All was part of a system designed to extract the last benefit from the victims before their elimination. The few who were not executed immediately were destined for slave labor in factories, quarries, armament workshops, or even in construction projects of the SS. The conditions were so brutal that life expectancy in these jobs was barely counted in weeks. Hunger was deliberate. The rations were calculated to keep them alive only long enough to produce, but not to survive in the long term. Disease and exhaustion completed what the gas chambers did not reach. Those who fell ill or could no longer work were sent without consideration to death. What differentiated the Third Reich from previous persecutions was not only the scale, but the administrative coldness with which the machinery of extermination was designed. The massacres ceased to be spontaneous acts or explosions of popular violence to become a process governed by orders, documents, schedules, and records. Each train that departed toward Auschwitz or Treblinka was carefully planned, with lists of deportees and timetables coordinated with the German railways. Each extermination operation counted on the participation of engineers who designed the facilities. doctors who supervised the selection of prisoners, and officials who authorized budgets and shipments of supplies. It was the industrialization of death, where bureaucracy and technology were placed at the service of genocide. The Nazis did not only seek to expel or marginalize the Jews, their goal was the complete disappearance of that population from Europe and, if possible, from the entire world. In their plans of expansion, they imagined a continent free of Jews, where their presence would be erased even from cultural memory. Documents and archives show how details were discussed about how many Jews remained in each country and how their transfer should be organized, a term used as a disguise to conceal the true destination. Even in the midst of the war, when Germany was already beginning to suffer military setbacks, enormous logistical and human resources continued to be allocated to keep the system of extermination running, which demonstrates the central character that antisemitism had within the Nazi project. At the end of the war, in 1945, the Holocaust had cost the lives of 6 million Jews, to which were added millions of other victims: Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, political opponents, disabled people, and persecuted minorities. In total, the number of deaths under Nazi violence reaches a magnitude that escapes human comprehension. But beyond the statistics, what emerges from the testimonies is the destruction of entire families, of communities that had existed for centuries and that were erased in a matter of months. Cities that once had a vibrant Jewish life were left empty, without active synagogues, without schools, without merchants or intellectuals, turned into landscapes of silence and absence. Antisemitism, which for centuries had been a constant of hatred, discrimination, and persecution in Europe, reached under the Third Reich its most radical form, a genocide planned and carried out with the explicit intention of extinguishing an entire people. It was the culmination of a process that began with stereotypes and prejudices transmitted from generation to generation, that later transformed into laws, social marginalization, and violence, and that ended in the crematory ovens of Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Sobibor. The memory of this tragedy is not only a dark chapter of history, but a constant warning about the destructive capacity that hatred can reach when it becomes the official doctrine of a state and when propaganda manages to convince an entire society that a human group lacks the right to exist. The lesson left by the Holocaust transcends time. It demonstrates that civilization and barbarism can coexist in parallel, and that only one political decision, supported by complicit silence or indifference, is enough to transform ordinary citizens into gears of a system of extermination. The Holocaust, the climax of historical hatred. The Holocaust did not arise from nothing. It was the result of a long history of prejudices, distrust, and persecutions that had accompanied the Jewish people for centuries, a process that spanned different times and contexts. In antiquity, there already existed religious tensions with neighboring empires. In the Middle Ages, Christianity, turned into the official religion in much of Europe, fed the image of the Jew as the deicidal people responsible for the death of Jesus. That idea turned into mass expulsions, such as those of England in 1290, France in 1306, and Spain in the year 1492, where entire communities were stripped of their homes and forced to wander in search of refuge. In Eastern Europe of the 18th and 19th centuries, the pogroms, waves of popular violence, often tolerated or promoted by the authorities, sowed terror in villages and cities, destroying homes, looting businesses, and murdering entire families. To all this was added, already in the 19th century, a new type of anti-Semitism, racial. It was a hatred that was not based on religion or on cultural difference, but on the idea that the Jews constituted an inferior race that had to be marginalized or eliminated. These antecedents were the breeding ground upon which Nazism could build its genocidal project. In the Third Reich, all those historical resentments found a form never before seen. the decision to eradicate the Jewish people in their entirety. The regime of Adolf Hitler did not limit itself to legal discrimination or sporadic violence, but went a step further, transforming hatred into a central political program. Antisemitism was not a mere aspect of Nazi ideology. It was its backbone. Propaganda repeated day and night that the Jews were responsible for Germany's defeats in the First World War, for the economic crisis, and for the supposed communist danger. That discourse little by little shaped the mentality of the German population until the elimination of the Jews was presented as something not only desirable, but necessary for the survival of the nation. When the Nazi genocidal machinery was set in motion, it did so with terrifying precision. The Holocaust became the most systematic and organized extermination project in history. It was not about improvised massacres nor about explosions of popular violence, as had happened in other moments of European history, but about a carefully designed plan executed with the apparatus of a modern state. The participation encompassed all levels: ministries, transport offices, railway companies, engineers who designed chambers, doctors who supervised experiments or selections, police and soldiers who guarded the trains and the camps. Every detail was calculated: the timetables of trains, the logistics of deportations, the administration of ghettos, the classification of prisoners into lists, and the elimination of any trace of the crimes. The process began with marginalization and isolation. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 were a breaking point. With them, the Jews were stripped of their German citizenship, forbidden to marry Aryans, and removed from public life. They lost jobs, properties, and basic rights. In a few years, they went from being full citizens to becoming pariahs within their own country. Later, in the occupied territories, policy became even harsher. The Jews were confined in ghettos, walled and guarded neighborhoods where they were forced to live in inhuman conditions. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest of all, came to concentrate more than 400,000 people in just a few square kilometers. Hunger was so devastating that families had to resort to food smuggling to survive, and mortality was so high that the streets filled with abandoned corpses. Diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis spread rapidly, and thousands died each month without the need for direct executions. However, these ghettos were never intended as a final destination, but as an intermediate stage toward extermination. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the Nazi regime took a qualitative leap in its annihilation policy. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile extermination units composed of police, SS members, and regular soldiers, followed closely behind German troops and began to carry out systematic massacres. In entire towns and villages, Jews were gathered, stripped of their belongings, and led to forests, ravines, or pits already prepared where they were executed en masse. The victims were forced to undress and line up at the edge of craters, to then be shot and fall upon the bodies of those who had died before. One of the most brutal massacres occurred at Babi Yar, on the outskirts of Kiev, in September of 1941. In just 2 days, more than 33,000 Jews were murdered by gunfire. Similar scenes were repeated in places such as Riga, Minsk, and Vilnius, leaving behind mass graves that even today continued to be discovered. But even this brutality had limitations from the Nazi point of view. The shootings, though effective in immediate terms, were considered inefficient for a continental extermination plan. Moreover, they created psychological problems in the executors themselves. There were soldiers and police who suffered nervous breakdowns from having to repeatedly shoot women, children, and the elderly. It was in that context when Nazi authorities began to look for an industrial method that would allow killing on a large scale, with less direct contact and greater speed. That search derived in the creation of extermination camps, facilities designed exclusively for death. In 1942, the Wannsee Conference formalized what became known as the Final Solution. There, high-ranking Nazis designed the plan to deport all the Jews of Europe to camps specially built to murder them en masse. Thus were born the extermination centers in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. These were not prisoner camps like Dachau or Buchenwald, where inmates were exploited in forced labor, but authentic factories of death. The deportation trains, managed with the meticulousness of a national railway system, arrived daily packed with men, women, the elderly, and children. Upon arrival at the selection ramps, officers decided in seconds who could be useful as slave labor and who should be sent directly to the gas chambers. The majority, especially women, the elderly, and children, were led unknowingly to their immediate execution. The chambers were disguised as collective showers. Once the doors closed, Zyklon B, or carbon monoxide gas, was released. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of people were murdered. Their bodies were later cremated in specially designed ovens or buried in mass graves when the incineration machinery could not keep pace with the killing. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the symbol of the Holocaust, not only for the number of victims, more than 1 million people died there, but because it represented the bureaucratic perfection of genocide. There were barracks, slave labor factories, medical experiments, crematory ovens, and chambers in one same complex. Doctors such as Josef Mengele selected prisoners to perform inhuman experiments, while the SS administered the camp with ruthless efficiency. The magnitude of the Holocaust was such that at the end of the war, about 6 million Jews had been exterminated. That represented approximately 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. But the horror was not limited to the Jews. Millions of other victims, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, the disabled, homosexuals, political opponents, were also persecuted and murdered. However, what differentiated the Jews was that their extermination was not tied to what they did or failed to do, but simply to their existence. For the Nazis, the simple fact of being Jewish was a death sentence. What makes the Holocaust the climax of historical hatred is not only the scale of the slaughter, but the combination of ideology, technology, and modern bureaucracy at the service of extermination. It was a genocide planned with the coldness of an administrative operation, executed with the efficiency of a production line, and legitimized by a propagandistic apparatus that convinced millions that it was something necessary for the racial purity of the Reich. The Holocaust left indelible scars on humanity. It demonstrated how far hatred can go when it is fed for centuries and when it becomes state policy. It showed how an entire people can be dehumanized to the point of being seen as an absolute enemy that must disappear. It was the darkest outcome of a history of prejudices that had been accumulating since antiquity. When the Allied armies liberated the camps in 1945, the world was horrified at what it discovered. Mountains of corpses, chambers still impregnated with the smell of death, crematory ovens, and skeletal survivors who were the living proof of that hell. The phrase, "never again," became a cry of memory and warning. The Holocaust was, in essence, the culmination of a hatred that had accompanied the Jewish people for millennia, but transformed by Nazi ideology into a modern genocide, planned, rationalized, and executed with industrial coldness. It was the climax of historical hatred, the moment when ancestral prejudices became the most monstrous crime of humanity. Antisemitism, after 1945, a hatred that did not disappear. Many people thought that with the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945 and the revelation of the horror of the extermination camps, antisemitism would disappear forever. The Holocaust had shown the world how far hatred toward the Jews could go, and the images of Auschwitz, Treblinka and Dachau seemed enough to immunize humanity against future prejudices. However, reality was much more complex. Antisemitism did not die with Hitler, it simply changed forms, settings and discourses. After the war, Europe was left devastated with millions of displaced people and a profound moral crisis. The surviving Jews who had lost their families and homes faced a world that in many cases remained hostile. In Poland, for example, in 1946, the Kielce pogrom occurred, where more than 40 Jews were murdered by their own neighbors after a false rumor of ritual crime. This episode demonstrated that even after the Holocaust, the old anti-Semitic myths were still alive in European society. Thousands of Jews then understood that they could no longer trust in finding safety in their countries of origin, which accelerated the exodus toward Palestine and, after 1948, toward the new state of Israel. The creation of Israel in May of 1948 radically changed the nature of anti-Semitism. For the first time in centuries, the Jews had their own state. But this also meant that the prejudices against them began to be linked to the political and geopolitical arena. The Arab-Israeli conflict gave rise to a new type of hostility. While traditional anti-Semitism in Europe had been religious or racial, in the Arab world and in certain international sectors, it began to take the form of political and ideological rejection toward Zionism and toward Israel. Often, this political opposition was confused with or mixed with anti-Jewish prejudices, generating a new form of anti-Semitism that presented itself under the disguise of political criticism. During the Cold War, anti-Semitism also found space in the Soviet bloc. Although the Soviet Union had fought the Nazis and denounced the Holocaust, Stalin's regime maintained an ambiguous policy toward the Jews. During the years following the war, anti-Semitic purges were developed disguised as campaigns against cosmopolitanism or against enemies of the people. The famous doctors' plot in 1953, in which a group of Jewish doctors was falsely accused of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders, is a clear example of how old anti-Jewish stereotypes were instrumentalized by a modern state for political purposes. In Western Europe, anti-Semitism did not disappear completely. Although the Nuremberg trials and the memory of the Holocaust imposed a taboo on open expressions of hatred, prejudices persisted in more subtle forms. Discrimination in workplaces, stereotypes about the economic power of the Jews, or conspiracy theories that pointed to them as responsible for social and financial changes in the world. In America, especially in the United States, there were also tensions. During the 1950s and 1960s, while the North American Jewish community was becoming stronger, there were those who accused it of controlling Hollywood, the banks, or the media. At the same time, anti-Semitism began to intertwine with new conspiracy theories, in which the Jews were seen as hidden actors of a new world order. These myths, inherited in part from old pamphlets such as the false protocols of the Elders of Zion, found a second life in the era of mass communication. Anti-Semitism also expressed itself with violence in the second half of the 20th century. Attacks against synagogues, desecrated cemeteries, and terrorist attacks, such as the one committed in 1980 in the synagogue of Rue Copernic in Paris, or the attack against the AMIA in Buenos Aires in 1994, showed that anti-Jewish hatred continued to have deadly consequences. With the arrival of the 21st century, anti-Semitism has found new spaces, especially on the Internet. Social networks and forums have amplified old discourses of hatred and given global visibility to extremist groups. Conspiracy theories such as that the Jews control the world economy or that they are behind wars and international crises have adapted to modern times and continue to circulate, feeding prejudices in new generations that did not live through the Second World War nor the Holocaust. Today, antisemitism adopts multiple faces. In some cases, it disguises itself as radical nationalism, in others as religious extremism, and in others as supposed political criticism against Israel that crosses the line into hatred against the Jews as a people. In Europe, in the United States, in Latin America, and in the Middle East, this hatred has not disappeared. It has simply mutated, changing form to survive in each era. The Holocaust demonstrated the extreme consequences of antisemitism, but it did not manage to eradicate it. Hatred toward the Jews is one of the most persistent prejudices in human history, capable of adapting to cultural, political, and technological changes. After 1945, the world swore never again, but reality reminds us that that oath requires constant vigilance, education, and memory. Antisemitism after the Second World War is not a relic of the past, but a threat that remains alive, a hatred that has shown a disturbing capacity to reinvent itself and to survive throughout time.